Before fast food took over the American highway, sit-down chains ruled it. Orange roofs, automats that dispensed fruit from little glass windows, five-and-dime lunch counters that became battlegrounds of the civil rights movement, and steakhouses that could seat hundreds of people at once. Almost all of them are gone now, and most Americans under 40 have never heard of half the names on this list. Stick around for number 1. It's the story of a single chain that, at its peak, outsold McDonald's, Burger King, and KFC combined, and it's a name you'll recognize even if you've never once eaten there. This is Top 10 Classic American Diner Chains that disappeared. Number 10. White Tower. White Castle basically invented the fast food hamburger business in 1921, and just 5 years later, 2 Wisconsin businessmen decided the best strategy was to copy it exactly. White Castle sued in 1929 and won $82,000, over $1 million today, but White Tower kept operating anyway. It actually grew to 230 locations by 1949. What killed it wasn't the lawsuit, it was the drive-thru. White Tower never adapted to car culture after World War II the way its competitors did, and it slowly faded into irrelevance over the following decades. Almost unbelievably, one last White Tower location in Toledo, Ohio, held on all the way until 2022, when a small fire closed it for good, and it simply never reopened. Number 9. Toddle House. If you've ever eaten a Waffle House omelet, you've technically tasted a piece of Toddle House history. Founded in the late 1920s by a Texas lumberman using leftover building supplies, Toddle House was a tiny 24-hour breakfast diner chain built for speed. A dozen backless stools, stainless steel everything, and a promise to get you in and out in 12 minutes. The founder even invented a mechanical cashier box, specifically so the cooks never had to touch money. At its peak, Toddle House had more than 200 locations across the South. It fizzled through the 1960s after being sold off in 1962, and the name slowly disappeared even as many of the actual buildings kept operating as other restaurants. Here's the detail that connects it to something you'd actually recognize today. Waffle House founder Joe Rogers Sr. got his start working the grill at a Toddle House, which is exactly where he learned to make the specific style of omelet that Waffle House still serves. Number 8. Schrafft's. Schrafft's started as a candy company's marketing gimmick in 1898 and became something much bigger. One of the first restaurant chains built specifically to welcome women dining without men, at a time when that was genuinely unusual. Cooks, supervisors, and even executives were women. By 1928, Schrafft's was pulling in $1 million a month just from lunch sales in New York City alone, and the Great Depression actually helped it expand. Falling rents let it grow to over 40 locations by 1937 across New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. It stayed a genuine cultural institution through the 1950s. Then taste shifted. The chain's old-fashioned charm started reading as just old, and locations began closing through the 60s and 70s. The very last Schrafft's shut its doors in 1984, quietly ending a chain that had spent most of a century being one of the few places in America where a woman could comfortably eat lunch alone. Number 7. Valley's Steakhouse. Donald Valley, an Italian immigrant, opened a 12-seat cafe in Portland, Maine in 1933 and built it into a New England steakhouse empire known for massive portions and dining rooms that sat hundreds of guests at once. By the mid-1960s, with 3 locations in the Boston area alone, Valley's was serving more than 200,000 customers a week and employing 1,300 people. At its 1970s peak, it had over 30 locations stretching from Maine down through Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Then Donald Valley died in 1977, and everything that had been holding the empire together started coming apart. Inheritance taxes, the decade's energy crisis, rising labor costs, and a dining public that had moved on from massive banquet hall steakhouses. Most locations closed by the early 1990s. The very last Valley's, somehow still hanging on, finally closed in August 2000, 67 years after that first 12-seat cafe. Number 6. Woolworth's Lunch Counters. Quick pause here, because this one carries more weight than a menu ever could. Woolworth's added lunch counters to its five-and-dime stores back in the 1910s as a simple revenue add-on. Fresh food, fast service, and notably progressive for the era in employing women as counter managers. For decades, it was just a convenient place to grab a sandwich while you shopped. Then, in 1960, 4 black college students sat down at the segregated Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and refused to leave. That single sit-in sparked similar protest across the entire South and became one of the defining moments of the civil rights movement, eventually forcing the desegregation of Woolworth's counters nationwide. The stools from that Greensboro counter now sit permanently in the Smithsonian. The stores themselves lasted until 1997, when discount retailers like Walmart and Target finally finished off the 5-and-dime model for good. But the lunch counter itself had already earned a permanent place in American history decades before the chain went out of business. Number 5. Horn and Hardart Automats. Picture a restaurant with no waiters, no cashiers at the tables, just walls of small glass-fronted compartments where you drop a nickel, open a little door, and pull out a sandwich, a slice of pie, or a cup of coffee poured from a dolphin-shaped spout. Horn Hardart opened the first American automat in Philadelphia in 1902, using waiterless restaurant technology imported from Berlin, then brought the concept to Times Square in 1912. It became such a fixture of New York life that at its peak, the chain operated more than 100 locations in New York City alone. The automat was practically synonymous with mid-century American dining for decades before fast food chains started offering the same speed with none of the mechanical charm. Locations closed gradually through the 1970s and 80s. The last Philadelphia area automat shut down in 1990, and the very last one anywhere, at 3rd Avenue and 42nd Street in New York, closed on April 9, 1991, ending nearly 90 years of dropping nickels into little glass doors. Number 4. Sambo's. Here's where this list gets genuinely uncomfortable, and it's worth sitting with why. Sambo's launched in 1957, its name a mashup of founders Sam Battistone and Newell Bonnet, but the chain leaned hard into an association with the story of Little Black Sambo, decorating locations with murals and mascots straight out of the book, and it worked, commercially, at a staggering scale. By 1979, Sambo's had grown to 1,117 locations across 47 states, doing the equivalent of $1.6 billion in sales at its height. As the civil rights movement gained ground, the name became an active liability, with communities refusing permits unless it changed. But the chain's actual collapse came from a pileup of unrelated disasters. 600 managers walked out after a restructuring in 1979, an executive was caught funneling company funds into a cattle ranching scheme, health code fines piled up, and lawsuits came from every direction. By 1982, most locations were sold off and the company filed for bankruptcy. The very first Sambo's in Santa Barbara held on to the original name longer than any other location in the country and only changed it in 2020 in the wake of the George Floyd protests, finally closing the book on a name the company had defended for over 60 years. Number 3. Steak and Shake, the original footprint. This one's different from everything else on this list because Steak and Shake technically still exists. You can still order a steak burger today. But the chain you'd recognize from its mid-century peak is functionally gone. At its high point in 2018, Steak and Shake operated 626 full-service restaurants, the kind with servers, booths, and a genuine diner atmosphere. Since then, it's closed hundreds of locations, down to roughly 400 by the early 2020s, while converting most of what's left from full table service into self-service, quick counter operations to cut costs. Competition from fast casual chains like Chipotle, years of underinvestment following aggressive price cuts, and expensive lawsuits all chipped away at the business. The company avoided outright bankruptcy through debt restructuring in 2021, but the original footprint, the sit-down, server-brought-your-shake, mid-century diner experience, is essentially extinct, even though the name on the sign never changed. Number 2. Bob's Big Boy. We covered this one in full detail in its own video, so here's the short version. In 1936, a 21-year-old named Bob Wien invented the double-decker hamburger 3 decades before the Big Mac existed, built a mascot so recognizable it became a roadside icon, and grew the Big Boy name into more than 950 restaurants nationwide through a loose, handshake-based franchise system. Marriott bought it in 1967, sold it to the Elias brothers in 1987, and an ill-fated acquisition of the Shoney's chain triggered a 2000 bankruptcy that gutted the company. The twist is that the Big Boy name actually survived. Regional offshoots like Frisch's still operate across the Midwest today, while the original Southern California chain, the one that started it all, shrank to just 5 restaurants around Los Angeles. If you want the full story, including the statue and the jazz musicians who started it all, it's linked right here. Number 1. Howard Johnson's, and here's the biggest one of them all, also covered in its own dedicated video. Howard Johnson's, built from a single Quincy, Massachusetts pharmacy in 1925 into the single largest restaurant chain in the entire United States. By 1965, Howard Johnson's sales had surpassed McDonald's, Burger King, and KFC combined, not one of them, all three added together. At its peak, more than 1,000 orange-roofed restaurants and 500 motor lodges stretched across 42 states and Canada, making it the default stop on every American road trip for 2 straight decades. The oil crisis, fast food competition, and a corporate sale to Marriott that valued the real estate more than the restaurants themselves gutted the chain from the inside out. By its final years, exactly one Howard Johnson's remained in the entire country, a single location in Lake George, New York, that had been serving customers for 70 years. It closed permanently in June 2022. No chain on this entire list fell from a higher peak, and no other closure marked the end of an era quite as cleanly. The full story, the pharmacy, the 28 flavors, the orange roofs, all of it, is linked right here. 10 chains, one clear pattern. Sit-down American dining used to be dominated by names most of us have completely forgotten, and every single one of them lost to the same thing: speed, cars, and a fast food industry that figured out how to do cheaper and faster what these chains built entire empires doing slower and better. Which one of these did you actually grow up with? Tell me in the comments, and if you haven't already, go watch the full Howard Johnson's and Bob's Big Boy stories linked above.